So when we left off at the end of Star Trek Into Darkness, a faction within Starfleet had stumbled upon the exiled 20th century warlord Khan Noonien Soong in a cryotube on a ship floating in deep space. They forced him to help them develop weapons so that they could stage a military coup of the United Federation of Planets, corrupting the soul of Starfleet and forcing us to be suspicious of it in a way that we never have before. They don't get into it in the film, but this kind of violates some of the fundamental tenets of the Federation's relationship with technology. Khan was exiled during a worldwide conflict known as the Eugenics Wars because he was the result of breeding experiments designed to create a superior type of human. Indeed, Khan's strength and intelligence far exceed the normal capabilities of humans, and even his blood cells were so powerful that they were used to create a serum that literally brought James Kirk back to life after lethal radiation exposure killed him stone dead. This represents a huge break from tradition and the morality and attitude towards technology Starfleet has always exhibited in past iterations of the franchise. In addition, Into Darkness poses several real-world challenges for everyone in charge of creating the next film in the series. The two reboot continuity films that have been released so far have already used Khan, time travel, the Klingons, and the Romulans as major plot elements. With these concepts off the table, the original series and the film series that followed offer few obviously filmable stories that don't retread territory already well covered by the last two films. With most of the big guns and mothballs, what's left? This is how I would resolve that question. So the beginning of the film is about this unrest, and also about addressing the ridiculousness of the technological advances that happened in the last two movies. The Khan blood super serum, a transporter that can instantly move Khan from Earth to Kronos, etc. The first act would be about society getting kind of pissed off that all these sudden advances in technology were used by Starfleet to make weapons, and other people stepping up with their own opinions about what they would do if they were given that kind of power. People trying to make the case that Starfleet doesn't deserve the leadership role they occupy in the Federation. I see the Federation as sort of a technocracy, where people value innovation. The mandate placed on Starfleet by the citizens of the Federation to constantly seek out new life and new civilization sort of requires this to be the case. Now that no one trusts Starfleet's leadership, the citizens of the Federation start looking elsewhere for someone to stand at the vanguard of the innovation and exploration they value so dearly. One consequence of this is that we start to see a revival of capitalism, of private industry, and entrepreneurship. The main entity the Enterprise crew would be going up against in this story would be one such private corporation, possibly even called the Enterprise Group as a slap in the face to Starfleet by paying tribute to Captain Kirk and his crew for thwarting an emerging military oligarchy by rebelling against authority. This organization is headed up by one or more classic Trek characters. Maybe Harry Mudd reimagined as a Richard Branson or Mark Zuckerberg analog tech billionaire, or maybe Spock's half-brother Sybok as a new-agey Steve Jobs-style guru/huckster. You could throw Gary Mitchell in there as a dark mirror of Kirk meant to force him to question which side of the new battle lines he really falls on, and maybe even Data's creator Dr. Noonien Soong if he's meant to be alive during this time period. For plot purposes, though, the most important player in this organization is Carol Marcus, who has started playing with fire the way that she did when she created the Genesis device back in the original film series. The Enterprise organization's biggest current project is basically the trumped-up 24th century version of Google Glass, a self-replicating, self-directing artificial organism that would theoretically enter Earth's ecosystem via water and food supplies and start improving and upgrading the bodies of anyone who's exposed to it. It would give everyone a tricorder and a communicator and a universal translator right in their brain. No external gadgets or objects required. It's this film continuity's version of the Genesis device. Instead of terraforming planets, it terraforms the human brain itself. It is probably called Project Genesis, and the film could even be called Star Trek Genesis, with or without the colon, I don't care. To increase the parallels to the Wrath of Khan's Project Genesis even more, as the story begins, a planet has already undergone beta testing of a sort of the Genesis nanotech. A Genesis planet designated to allow the Enterprise organization to prove that Project Genesis can be introduced to an existing ecosystem without altering or damaging any of the life forms there in unwanted ways. The next phase of the experiment calls for a group of volunteer settlers to live on the planet and allow Project Genesis to enter their bodies and begin making its improvements. The USS Enterprise has been assigned to escort this group of settlers to the Genesis planet, as the project is incredibly controversial and there are legitimate fears that the settlers might be attacked en route. The project is opposed on Earth by traditionalists who fear the implications of the Genesis technology and worry that indiscriminate deployment of Project Genesis will result in the contamination of pre-warp civilizations who are under the protection of the Prime Directive. Further opposition comes from the Klingons, who have a dogmatic and ritualistic society that values tradition above all. This makes them natural enemies of the Genesis Project, natural advocates of the viewpoint that by coding their own priorities and ideals into a piece of technology that behaves like a contagious virus, the Enterprise group threatens to infect other cultures with their own, erasing traditions and idiosyncrasies inconsistent with their vision. Depending on how stacked the cast is already with classic Trek characters, it may even be worthwhile to cast the undiscovered country's General Chang as the face of Klingon opposition to Project Genesis, and/or Lieutenant Valeris or Lieutenant Savick as a mysterious special envoy from the Federation who has unclear loyalties and could serve as the third vertex in a love triangle between Spock and Uhura. On course to the Genesis planet, the Enterprise detects a bunch of Klingon birds of prey decloaking in the distance. At first, the crew puts shields up and prepares for battle, but something's off. The Klingon ships didn't decloak in the path of the Enterprise as if to engage it. They decloaked some distance away in a seemingly random location. The sensors show no signs of battle, and the birds aren't moving. If they see the Enterprise on their own sensors, they're not moving to intercept, nor are they responding to hails or any other communication. The Enterprise crew wants to investigate, but fearing a trap, the settlers refuse to go anywhere near the Klingon ships. Kirk agrees that bringing the settlers to the Klingons' doorstep is unwise, but still feels it's necessary to try and figure out what's going on. He leads an away team to attempt to make contact with the Klingons and orders the Enterprise and the settlers to hold tight and wait for further orders. Tensions raise to outrageous levels on board the Enterprise, as settlers and crew members both begin to feel like sitting ducks in space, just begging to be attacked. Upon reaching the Klingon fleet, there's still no response and no sign of activity from anyone on board. Kirk and his team board the Klingon flagship, and suddenly the Klingon ships all raise shields and cut off communication to or from the away team. The chain of command is thrown into chaos, and for lack of a better option, the Enterprise slams into warp and rushes towards the Genesis planet at top speed, where the settlers can be safely deposited on the planet's surface, a place where their enemies will refuse to follow for fear of becoming contaminated with Project Genesis. When we rejoin Kirk and his away team on board the Klingon flagship, we find it seemingly abandoned, ship systems turning on and off at random, and sensor readings increasingly inconsistent about whether or not there are any other life forms on the ship. To add to the atmosphere of confusion and dread, several low-quality nature sounds and classical music by Earth composers begin to play over the ship's speakers. Astute space nerds may realize that these are the sounds that were contained on the Golden Record that was placed upon the Voyager 1 spacecraft for the benefit of any intelligent life forms that might ever come across it. By now, some people in the audience will have begun to suspect the truth about what happened to the Klingon ships, and when Kirk and his company reach main engineering, their suspicions will be dramatically confirmed. The Klingons are being assimilated by the Borg. The Voyager 1 Gold Record recordings are a nod to the fan theory that the Borg were the ones who gave the Voyager 1 spacecraft sentience and sent it back to Earth in Star Trek The Motion Picture. This is the earliest we've ever seen the Borg timeline-wise in the Star Trek universe, so they're a bit slow and primitive compared to other iterations of the Borg that we've seen. It seems to be taking them a while to fully assimilate the Klingons, but boy genius Chekhov quickly surmises what's happening, and McCoy realizes with horror that the Borg must be after Project Genesis, which would allow them to assimilate entire worlds instantly. The away team unanimously decides the Borg must be stopped and set about trying to deliver a self-destruct command that will eliminate the entire Klingon fleet, eliminating the Borg threat, but killing themselves in the process. It seems as though they're going to succeed in destroying themselves until the last possible second, when a Borged-out General Chang suddenly activates and approaches the away team. But instead of attacking, Chang suddenly drops to his knees and begs Kirk to allow him to explain the situation. The assimilation of the Klingon ships wasn't meant as an attack, and Chang himself has not been fully assimilated, just put into contact with the Borg collective. What looked like an attack was actually an attempt to communicate. The Borg aren't here to steal Project Genesis, they want to destroy it. They approached the Klingons because they have few resources in this quadrant and needed allies. The Klingons are the galaxy's most outspoken critics of the Genesis project. The Borg are terrified of Project Genesis. The moment it was first used on a sentient being, the Borg sensed the presence of a new superior consciousness in the galaxy, a more powerful hive mind that could potentially wipe out all of the collective's accomplishments. The Borg were conceived in a pre-internet America as a twisted reflection of the Federation, a nightmare vision of where unchecked technological advancements could lead us to serve as a contrast to the utopian Federation. We were meant to be afraid of them, but in this story, they're afraid of us. The dark future the Borg were created to represent seems quaint compared to the implications of the advancements we've made since then, and so they're no longer concerned with destroying or assimilating us. They came to beg for mercy. Kirk and his team are confused by Borg Chang's assertion that Project Genesis has already been tested on a sentient being. Human testing is not supposed to have happened yet, and the Federation only approved human testing within the confines of the quarantined Genesis planet, where the effects of the technology could be observed safely and without any danger of contamination. Hoping for the best, but knowing in his heart the worst is probably true, Kirk strikes an uneasy alliance with the Borg and sets course for the Genesis planet. There, Carol Marcus reveals that she infected herself with Project Genesis long before the start of the film, that she became the first member of a new collective consciousness, and that all of the settlers and all of the other members of the Project Genesis board of directors have been mere facets of her the entire time. She is effectively the new Borg queen, and under her command, all of the people she's infected manifest the worst nightmares of the traditionalists who oppose the Enterprise organization's transhumanist agendas. The Genesis nanites within the bodies of the assimilated settlers and Enterprise crew members transform them into inhuman monsters, their limbs and organs becoming weapons. A battle between Marcus and her drones and an alliance between the uninfected Enterprise crew members, the Klingons, and the Borg culminates with the destruction of the Enterprise and the exile of Carol Marcus on the surface of the Genesis planet, a floating prison which will henceforth be watched over by a new Federation that includes the newly humbled and more reasonable Borg collective, the Klingon Empire, and the existing citizens of the previous United Federation of Planets. A new balance of power to replace the old one that was wrecked when Nero destroyed the planet Vulcan. A bigger and stronger and more diverse depiction of an interstellar multicultural society to serve as the backdrop for future stories. The destruction of the actual literal Starship Enterprise is a trope at this point that's been repeated in several of the big screen Trek epics, but in this case I would intend it to signify that this is the final on-screen adventure of Kirk and his crew in this timeline. I would even consider marooning Kirk on the Genesis planet with Dr. Marcus, essentially freezing him in carbonite in order to be brought back again later on when the time is right. Maybe he spends much of the film questioning his legacy and struggling with how to view his own mortality after dying a heroic death but then being brought back by technology that should not exist. The next film would be set a couple hundred years in the future, in the reboot continuity's Next Generation era. The ongoing cooperation between the Federation, the Klingon Empire, and the Borg has resulted in a status quo that is in many ways markedly different from the one we know, but also in other ways markedly similar. Worf is not the only Klingon in the Federation, for example, but he's still considered to be a rising star in Starfleet that occupies a still singular role in ongoing relations between Earth and Kronos. Data's around, but there are more than one of him. Dr. Noonien Soong's work found greater acceptance in this universe because Starfleet felt that it was important to develop artificial intelligence that valued individuality. A robot that wishes to be more like a human was maybe seen as the perfect tonic to Carol Marcus's desire to smooth out the galaxy's idiosyncrasies in the name of dictatorial efficiency. The new next-gen Enterprise crew might feature multiple androids, all played by the same actor that all have radically different personalities. Data Prime, who is the first and is the highest ranking in Starfleet, is still very much like our Data from the original continuity, but we can now play him off other androids who have more developed identities and stronger emotional whims and preferences in much the same way that the original Data played off the strong personalities of the rest of the bridge crew in the original next-gen cast. He's the most robotic of all the androids, but inevitably, paradoxically, also the most human.